great for making it tonight. We're pretty excited about the ability to get some feedback on Lower Village, specifically on zoning. So what I wanted to do tonight was just give a kind of just a brief overview and get a sense of who from the different boards are on the call tonight. And then I'm going to hand it over to our two presenters, and I'll have them introduce themselves shortly. You know, obviously, I don't think anybody on this call needs to be kind of reminded about how long the town has been planning for improvements to Lower Village. I know just about everybody I see on here has been involved in one way or another over the years. I just wanted to kind of just remind us how we got to this particular evening and kind of where we're going to go from here, because we're going to dive into some particulars over the course of the evening. So I just wanted to briefly touch on the process. The Lower Village Revitalization Subcommittee was a subcommittee that the planning board created to specifically design to basically look at all of the planning that had been done about Lower Village over the past decade or two, and really take that, condense it into something that was functional and create a vision around what the town was really seeking to gain in Lower Village. And so they've done that. They produced that report back almost 18 months ago, 2 years ago now. And one of the key findings and recommendations was that we work with a consultant, a zoning consultant specifically, to really help us understand at the time, help our department understand how we could craft basically a new zoning bylaw, an updated zoning bylaw for Lower Village that would get us in line with the vision that was produced by that subcommittee. I think if there's one takeaway from that whole process that just to kind of be thinking about as we go through tonight, the zoning we currently have on the books in Lower Village will not get us to the vision that the Lower Village subcommittee provided and developed. There is no pathway from there to here, or from here to there with that zoning that is in place. And so what Peter and Bob are going to be talking about tonight is really about what the kind of changes that we can make to really help the town basically realize its vision. So this part of this effort was funded through the planning board's own consulting and master plan fund, and part of it was funded through a community compact grant. So we're very grateful to have that to kind of get it off the ground. I think before we hand it over to Peter and Bob, I just wanted to kind of go through quickly and have some of the different members. This is a joint boards meeting. I thought it would be helpful for everybody to know who was in the room and kind of who you're representing, because we don't get to often have a lot of these joint boards meetings. So I'm just going to go in kind of order of who I have on my screen, so I might jump around a bit. Lori, I'll start with you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Lori Clark. I'm the current chair of the planning board.
Thanks, Lori. And Jen? You're muted, Jen.
Sorry about that. I'm Jen Giroux, and I am on the EDIC, the Economic Development and Industrial Committee, as well as the Lower Village Rejuvenation Committee, excuse me.
Thanks, Jen. And I realized I just started talking as we got this meeting going. I'm just going to formally introduce myself. I'm Jesse Stedman, the town planner in Stowe, for those who I may not have met yet. And Karen, I'll pass it to you.
Hi, Karen Kelleher, a member of the planning board.
And Nancy?
Nancy Arsenault, new planning board member and new appointee to the Lower Village Revitalization Committee.
Right. And Mark?
Mark Jones, a voting associate member of the planning board.
All right. Tom?
Tom Farnsworth, EDIC in the Lower Village Subcommittee.
Great, thank you. Megan?
Hi, Megan Birchmcmichael, select board member and member of the Lower Village Revitalization Subcommittee.
Great. And Mary?
Brand new member to the EDIC.
Great. Welcome, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. As crazy as it may seem.
And Serena, I know you're joining us by phone.
Yes, hi. Glad to be here, a member of the EDIC group. Yeah, thank you.
Great. I think I've caught all of the representing members of the different committees that were on tonight. Let me see, I have a second screen here. I think I've got everybody. If I've missed anybody, feel free to raise a hand or introduce yourself. From there, I'm gonna hand it over to Peter Flinker and Bob Mitchell. Peter, you may recognize, has also worked with the town on the Stowe Acres project. I know we've had a few forums on that process, but Peter and Bob both have been a great resource in understanding Lower Village. They have a wealth of knowledge from various business districts throughout the state in their line of work, both in zoning and landscape architecture. And so we're very grateful to have them here. I will hand it over to them and let them introduce themselves further. Thank you, Peter and Bob.
Great. Thanks, Jesse. And good to be back in Stowe virtually, if not in person. Yeah, we've been looking at the Lower Village for a while. It's amazing how fast a year goes by. But we're glad to be here tonight to share some of our conclusions. I think, as you probably remember, our job was not to write new zoning. So we're not going to present detailed zoning recommendations tonight, but really to clarify what the zoning needs to look like overall, and how, based on, as Jesse said, our experience elsewhere and our observations and study of the Lower Village, what we think would be the best approach. Because there were a lot of questions when we started. So we're hoping to answer some of those questions and then put you in good shape to actually go forward and revise your draft zoning and sort of move forward with implementation of that. I'm going to share my screen. And Bob, you want to introduce yourself while I find that?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Nice to be back in Stowe, even virtually, for tonight's meeting, and be meeting with you all to present some of what we've been working on with Jesse, some of which you've seen, but some new part of the reports, and some recommendations that for your consideration as you go on to the next phase of moving this vision forward towards implementation. So we look forward to the discussion with you and any questions and answers that we can certainly help out with.
And Peter and Bob, before we keep going, I just want to, I don't know if you have a few spots in the presentation where it might be helpful to get any clarifications or just take any quick questions on things. But otherwise, I was hoping that participants could kind of keep track of some of the questions that they have as we go through this presentation, and then have a bit of a Q&A at the end.
Yeah, it would be great. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So as I said, we're calling this sort of Lower Village zoning strategies, and a lot of what we're talking about tonight is part of the memorandum, sort of a short report that Bob has put together, which will be available afterwards if you haven't seen it yet. So we're really thinking about what's the best zoning strategy for this place and time, and how do we set the Lower Village up to be transformed into what you want it to be. We sort of started by looking at this impressive list of almost 2 decades of work, looking at the Lower Village in the context of the town master plan, doing several different rounds of sort of more specific design work. Of course, you had the improvements to the highway itself, which took up a great deal of time and thought. And now hopefully the end is in sight in terms of sort of setting the stage for that redevelopment that we hope to occur. Our project started with sort of a review of previous reports and a site visit. We looked at the Lower Village Revitalization Subcommittee's report and the other studies that have been done. Bob reviewed the existing zoning and the draft village bylaw. As you recall, last November or December, we had a zoning strategies workshop, sort of talk about some of the options. And then Bob put together a draft zoning strategies memo, and that was reviewed by staff, and I think the planning board as well. We got some feedback last winter. And then so what we're presenting now is kind of the final sort of strategy going forward. And part of the sort of uniqueness of the lower village is this context where you have a lot of land that's already been protected around it, also a lot of land that's been developed. So this is zoning really for a transformation of an existing place, infill development rather than what we'd call greenfield development, which is good because you're sort of recycling something that needs to be redone for the 21st century. It's difficult, as you know, because there's a lot of constraints, both in terms of space, the pattern of ownership, and of course the lack of public sewerage. And so we're not going to be answering all those issues tonight, but really focusing on what's the best approach to the zoning within this context where you're really trying to promote transformation and make it not only possible, but desirable for the owners to be looking at their balance sheet and saying, you know, I want to tear this building down and build something wonderful in its place. Can I afford to do that? How hard is that going to be? So we want to make that equation work for the owners. And so there's not just changing the zoning, but actually jumpstarting something that's going to transform this district. Again, you've got a variety of uses. There's some residential uses that probably aren't going anywhere around the north side. And then the business uses primarily where the opportunity lies. A lot of them have existed in their current form for many years. And one of the issues is that may be fine with a lot of the tenants of those businesses. They may not like the idea of having to pay more rent. So another key question is, how do we promote a level of development that meets your standards in terms of a wonderful village design that fits into the character of Stowe? How do we do that without pricing either the owners or the existing tenants out of the market? Always a sort of a tricky balance with this kind of village redevelopment project. And so we've sort of been looking at this pattern of development. You have the old common and a few remnant buildings. You have the large sort of shopping center, and then a number of strip development projects. And we've been looking at these and including some of the current proposals to redevelop some of these and thinking about how does the current zoning impact those and how could you change that process with the new zoning. We're also looking at the history of this place within the town. It's always been a gateway and also a gateway both ways. So what do you need as you enter the town? What do you learn? What does it signal to you as a visitor? What do you need as you leave the town or come back from work? And thinking about that both in terms of the aesthetic character and then the function of it. What kind of uses are best in this kind of a district? And then thinking also about the history of it from a physical form standpoint. It's evolved over time, and it never really was a sort of a downtown. It was sort of a classic rural village with a beautiful common and the different civic and religious uses, as well as outlying farms and small businesses. And then it evolved into something else over the 20th century primarily. So how do we, we're not going to be bringing it back to a little quiet country village. But the question is, how can we capture some of the essence of that going forward? So yeah, you still have some opportunities with the historic common. And clearly, there's some businesses historically that fit in well with the idea of a traditional walkable village. And then there's also businesses that do not fit in so well. So the question is, thanks. Again, how do we sort of set the stage to make it desirable for businesses that don't really fit into a walkable village to transition, to either build something new themselves, to rebuild in a way that that fits in better with your vision, or to bring in a new owner who's going to do something that fits in better. So that overall pattern is, as I said, it's really about zoning for a place that needs to be changed, needs to be transformed and filled with something new. But there's a lot of stuff that's already there. So we look, this is your vision statement from the report from 2019. And we thought it's good to sort of look at this again, and I've sort of emphasized a few of the things with bold, but to make an attractive gateway to Stowe, as I said, that's sort of a very logical thing. Of course, a key part of this is both working and shopping, but also living. And so we want to make this a place where living, working, shopping, dining, and recreation are all part of the mix. We wanted to project the history and character of Stowe through the architectural compatibility of buildings and streetscape, and really build on that sense of place that was perhaps lost as this evolved into more of an automobile-oriented district. We want it to be a place where you can meet and connect with other residents, visitors, and that would include civic spaces for gathering, wayfinding, so that as a gateway, you're sort of finding out what else is going on in the town and in the region, especially the farms and orchards and other open space assets within Stowe. And then I think to that concern I mentioned about, will the existing businesses want to pay more? Part of this is adding the value that's going to make those businesses more valuable themselves. So it's not just more valuable buildings, but a more valuable place for people to do business, whether it's services or shopping or entertainment. And part of that is making a space that's accessible by all modes of transportation. I think it's a very strong vision statement overall. Some of the principles that were also in the report, I think are really good base for the zoning and design guidelines going forward. Obviously, walkability, which implies bringing things close together, but then also making it really more comfortable to travel on foot than to get back in your car to drive back and forth. Part of that's having a strong mix of uses where people can live and shop and dine and run errands. But again, a place where you might go just to see what's going on, not necessarily because you have an errand, or if you have an errand, you can accomplish multiple things at once and then hang out, get a cup of coffee or whatever. The idea of including a diversity of housing opportunities seems like a great spot, particularly because it's, there's a lot of building coverage within this district, but it's not very tall. So there's an opportunity, can we put more homes on the second stories and use that to sort of generate income for the owners, as well as bringing life and life to the district, and then also more housing opportunities to the town. Talked about accessibility of various modes of transportation and ability levels. And then this idea of creating a distinct sense of place. How do we make it something that's a social place, but also resonates with the history of the town, values of the residents and the surrounding environment? Again, you have this sort of unique context as a gateway to Stowe. How do you reflect that to welcome people in and say, hey, I've really arrived at a place that's something different? And then by extension, for businesses, it's like, I'd rather be here than in the new shopping center in Maynard, because it has that sense of place that's going to attract people. So this was sort of a list I put together based on sort of the action strategies from the report, really breaking it down as what do you need to know as you go forward into the zoning. First is a planning and review process that's predictable, fair, and objective, which any zoning, Bob will affirm, should be. But we also, for this particular site, we have this physical context, but we also have an economic context that's changing very quickly. And we're not quite sure what the best, the highest and best uses of these different properties may be different in 10 or 15 years than it is today. So we need to, within the zoning, provide that flexibility to adapt to those changing market opportunities. So it can't be too much set in stone. As much as I'd love to draw a beautiful village and have that be the plan, it's probably not something that's appropriate in this site, because it's going to happen slowly over time, and it has to be able to adapt. And then the idea of fitting zoning to the local capacity for review. Jesse and his staff are really capable, but we need to make sure that they have the time to use this zoning. If it's just going to frustrate everybody, including you on the planning board and others, it's not going to be successful. So that's kind of the planning and review process. In terms of land use, I think you've expressed loud and clear that you want a diverse mix of uses with a broad range of housing opportunities. Again, we want to promote that compact and efficient layout to create a walkable village. But I think a really big part of what's important about the potential zoning is no matter what you do, it has to be shaped around this idea of the public realm. So it's sort of a key problem with typical commercial shopping district is that it's organized around the individual businesses, which is fine for what it is. But villages historically, as well as the more successful new villages, destination shopping centers, mixed use districts, they're organized around the public space that people are sharing between the buildings. So whatever happens, it has to sort of have that public realm as kind of the organizing element. And then within that, of course, is the idea of a cohesive and connected circulation system. So one of the ideas in the zoning is how can we simplify the circulation? So instead of having, a dozen different entrances and exits, we combine those. How do we get people to connect across the lot lines between the different properties? How do we close off some of the unnecessary curb cuts along the highway? And all of that is going to make circulation work better. It's going to make the whole district more coherent for people driving around. And it opens up space, of course, for pedestrian. And then within that, if we can promote a range of transportation choices, including providing the provisions within the zoning that sort of create those things over time, it's going to then support the rest of those goals. And then, of course, protecting and enhancing the natural environment, sort of key, especially, on the gateway to Stowe, where you want to be sort of demonstrating the best environmental principles and connecting physically and visually to that surrounding landscape. In terms of design, we want to foster a distinct sense of place. Part of our goal really is not necessarily to recreate, a historic, 19th or 18th century form necessarily for every new, gas station or whatever it is, but really think about how do we make authentic architecture that's responding to local traditions, but maybe is not literally a recreation of a historic building. And then the usual things which typically might go into design guidelines, and we'll talk about that later, sort of coordinating design for lighting and landscaping and signage and shared public spaces, and making all that really kind of a big idea for the whole district that helps to create, what you might think of as a brand identity, but also just aesthetically make it hang together as one sort of attractive composition. I think another key issue we have with commercial shopping strips everywhere is it's pretty chaotic in terms of all those elements. Everybody's doing their own thing. And that's part of what makes it so generally ugly and disappointing when we visit those places. And it's also the opposite of sense of place. So through that process, we can reflect the history and character of Stowe or create something new, but again, something that's authentic and maybe is expressing a new sense of place. And then some of the sort of basic things, having enough parking, but not too much. We'll talk more about that, supporting universal accessibility, and then promoting sustainability and energy efficiency and low impact development stormwater techniques that will, again, enhance the area rather than continuing to be a drain on the environment. So we also looked at the visual preference survey from 2013, and I think certainly learned that people in Stowe like your traditional buildings. But again, the challenge is how do we use a sort of traditional form without creating other problems like wasted space on upper stories that's, sort of roofs that look attractive but aren't really used that much. How do we make that space not just look like a traditional building that belongs in Stowe, but one that functions like a traditional building? It's a very interesting challenge. And then make it something that people can afford to build. So I'm going to show a few case studies, and some of these we've talked about, and then Bob is going to go over kind of our recommendations for the zoning. So this is one which I think we've talked about before, which is West Acton Village Center. Again, from the Streets Guide, it's very much designed to fit into the sort of small town character of Acton, with what we call sort of human scaled buildings, very traditional detailing. But some of the functional elements is you have a very comfortable pedestrian realm, a clear distinction of where you should walk, where the entrances to buildings are. The lighting has been very carefully designed so that it's usable after dark. There's a safe and distinctive crosswalk to get across the highway, et cetera. So it's sort of that combination of form and function, which makes the village work very well for lots of reasons.
Peter, could I just add
Sure.
a comment go back to that slide? So in thinking about your vision and the possibilities, it's important to keep in mind that while, yes, most of the land there is in private ownership, responsibility lies both in the private sector and the public sector. And the public realm, as we call it, the roads, the sidewalks, the lighting, the street trees, the landscaping, have an equal importance almost as to what happens on the private side. And this is a good example of, you have the jut out that narrows the road, making it a safer environment for pedestrians. You have landscaping with street trees put in, and a distinctive crosswalk with textured material, not just paint, but textured material. All of those are a sign to the pedestrian that this is a safer environment for not just people in cars, but for people walking on the sidewalks or going to the shops. And so the public realm is something you want to keep in mind as to going forward, how that can be improved to align with the vision of the town for the lower village.
Right, and it's something that, we didn't used to think about too much with zoning, right? Zoning was only about, what's the landowner going to do when he's designing their particular lot, and how does that relate to the street, et cetera. But it wasn't really about the design of the street itself. So I think that's, and those of you who have sort of heard about or seen the idea of form-based codes, a lot of it is about the design of the public realm and the intersection between the public realm and the private realm of the buildings. The problem is a lot of towns don't know what they want. And so that may be something that needs to be a matter of further discussion. I think, as you'll hear, we're not really suggesting a full form-based code approach, but a lot of those ideas can be brought into, zoning at any level, or even, just through design guidelines. So I think one of the unique things about West Acton, as you probably know, is that it was, built by, I think, one family primarily, father and son, and actively engaged in programming and bringing people in. And that's sort of key probably to its success. It's not necessarily possible where you're just trying to change the zoning in a district where people are not ready to do this. So again, the question is, how do you make this possible? How do you encourage it? And then sort of hopefully light a spark in someone's mind that say, hey, I'd like to purchase that shopping center and rebuild something wonderful. I think the other interesting thing about Acton is it combines both the small buildings along the street and sort of larger structures behind, with parking behind and underneath. So they really did what you need to do in terms of building enough square footage to get your your cost per square foot down, but then also creating this wonderful pedestrian environment with the cute little buildings on the street. So it's essentially one large structure, but designed very carefully to do multiple things. Then you can see more that that's also connected again across, sort of multiple uses, if not multiple properties, with a sort of a single coherent sort of system of parking and movement. So you can pull into the back, find a parking space, period. It's not very complicated. Where again, part of the problem with Lower Village, as other places, there's just multiple places to pull in and out. It gets to be kind of confusing. And then the other advantage of West Acton is it was really part of a larger district, sort of embedded in surrounding district in a way that the Lower Village is not. So how can you maybe build some of this mix of uses, and again, bringing more residential uses into it and get a similar kind of mix of customers and clients for those businesses? So some of the things, this is kind of a summary of what they used for zoning strategies for West Acton, which we thought was interesting to think about as we think about the zoning for the Lower Village. One of the things the zoning does is really reinforce that idea of a walkable Main Street. Architecture is based on sort of reinforcing and extending the architectural character of the historic district. One of the planning strategies, of course, is they took over the state highway so that they could add on-street parking and make it narrower and add that crosswalk. And then into the zoning, they really focused on what I call village-friendly zoning. So there's no minimum lot area, no minimum frontage, no minimum width. They basically put some basic density limits on it of a 0.4 floor area ratio, but allowing that to go up to 0.7 if 50% of the building was residential, a 36-foot maximum height, and then a limit on the size of businesses to 5,000 square feet. I think one of the key questions for the Lower Village, and one where I certainly think the Stowe ratios are a good model, is how much parking do you need for a given area of retail? So in Acton, they have 1 space per 1,000 for retail, which is very modest compared to most. And then 3 spaces per 1,000 for a bank and a shopping plaza. So they're really, again, I think, fairly aggressively promoting this as a walkable district, not a destination driving district. They require connections between lots and then require pedestrian connections between them, and also required pedestrian spaces equal to 5% of the floor area to a maximum of 3,000 square feet. So again, just some very simple requirements, basically, limiting the size and mass of buildings, but otherwise allowing a lot of flexibility for people to do what they want. This is another one we've talked about, which is sort of a different approach. This is a much larger scale, but I think it has some lessons for the Lower Village. For one thing, they didn't have a historic Main Street like West Acton to bring buildings up to. So what they did is they created a new Main Street off of the highway. And those are basically your 2 choices in a lot of places. You have to do one or another if you're going to try to create any kind of a traditional village setting. So in South County Commons, they created this new Main Street and then basically designed a traditional streetscape with angle parking, fairly narrow travel lanes. And if you notice, the width of the sidewalks collectively is the same as the width of the travel lanes for cars, which is a very important thing if you're trying to encourage walking. Whereas a lot of our historic districts, unfortunately, there's more room for cars than there is for people. So they applied a lot of the lessons of looking at what makes a historic place work, and then also thinking about how do we attract people to a place where they'll park their car and then walk around this district. So again, it's all very carefully designed to function like a traditional village. But I think on a small scale, this is certainly an approach that could work for redevelopment of your shopping center there, where you, instead of having the building in the back with a giant parking lot, you create a short shared main street, have the buildings along that street and along the frontage perhaps, and then put the parking in the rear. And then again, programming is sort of the modern road to success. You can't just build it and hope that people will arrive. It's really, as with any downtown, there has to be something more than just the shops and restaurants there to bring people in. So in a sort of what you might call a lifestyle center like South County Commons, they actively have events and music to bring people in, you know, on the summer weekends and so on. This is another one more local, which is the Wayland Town Center, which again is designed according to sort of village planning principles. There's a new main street, attractive, fairly well-detailed buildings. A little bit of what I would say is kind of the developer's version of a New England town center, but not bad. But one of the things that they're doing, you can see there's nice lighting, and it's easy to find the entrances to buildings, and there's an interconnected system of pedestrian ways that connects to the main spine of the main street going through. So again, it's not just putting a sort of a New England face on a stripped commercial district. It's really trying to create a downtown. It is, you know, it is what it is, however. This is a former Raytheon plant, and they actually tore down the facility and put this a new road going in with that main street. There's a shopping, a large market, I think it's a Stop and Shop or something, with a big parking lot. But at least you have that shared pedestrian vehicular spine with on-street parking, which is kind of the classic core of a downtown. And then one of the things they did, of course, is brought in a lot of residential development around the outskirts. So there's sort of a shared center that actually has people living within walking distance, which makes a big difference. So again, some interesting lessons there. Chief among which is, you know, this sort of model of the village street works at a lot of different contexts. And then again, you know, programming was part of it from the beginning. So having a shared public space, shared pedestrian areas, but then also thinking about what's going to happen there? How can we bring people in? And then working with the developer and the businesses to activate that space. The last one I want to show you is a much smaller development. This is in Clinton, Connecticut, but I asked some planners I knew in Connecticut if they had good examples, and this was one that they brought up. Again, here it's a fairly simple site plan, but one of the nice things is that these are real, you could tell these are useful buildings. They have, you know, significant space on the upper stories that's occupied by, you know, it's residential in the back, it's offices in the front. But they're traditional buildings, but they really work. They're not just sort of a false top put on a strip. And the sense you get is, oh, I've really arrived someplace, because they've organized it around the buildings and the parking sort of weaves around through it. So there's, again, you sort of arrive, there's sort of a narrow parking space and or parking lot in the front. Sort of provides just head-in parking on one side, and then you pull into the back and you find other parking around the rear. So what you really focus on is these attractive commercial facades. Again, a very traditional sort of design approach, which was on purpose, but, you know, capturing not just the sort of historical architecture, but the sort of basic functional elements. A lot of transparency on the ground floor, the ability to look in, you know, especially at night and see what's going on, the ability to walk around and look, do a little window shopping, go back and forth between the different businesses, see what's happening, clear signage that's visible both for pedestrians as well as for people driving by on the street, and attractive lighting. There's sort of this cute little light standards that light up that facade in the evening. And that's, you know, within kind of a similar mixed district of a lot of sort of strip commercial that they're trying to transform into more of a node along the state highway. And then here you see, I mean, the site plan, it still accommodates the car, but at least the car and the pedestrian are a little bit more on equal terms. It's not necessarily just a giant parking lot. Would have been a lot easier, I think, for them to put all the buildings in the back with a big parking lot in the front. But I think they were encouraged to do it in a way that, again, balanced those different elements and create a little bit more of a sense of this is sort of a traditional building that contributes something to the rest of the village. And then in the back, there's, I think, a higher percentage of apartments, and you have sort of more traditional sort of townhouse architecture, but still with space for businesses around the back. And again, this is very useful in that you have some businesses in the front that pay a little bit more, and then your hair salons and so on that maybe are looking for a little less expensive space have a place to go even in this new development. So I think probably the residential uses are paying for this building. And so that allows the developer to accommodate the kind of small neighborhood businesses that you want to have and which you have in the lower village. And this is the zoning. I think that lot is right here. So it's not a special district, it's just a business district, but they have been encouraging this kind of development, I think, through design guidelines and other means. And I think they're in the process of thinking about a more comprehensive sort of village type zoning. So some of the lessons there in terms of zoning strategies, again, this idea of being perpendicular to the highway, to have mixed buildings in depth that sort of stretch back, along sort of an interior spine. So as a diagram, it's kind of similar to South County Commons on a much smaller scale, in that you have this sort of street that goes back with the buildings along it. Distributed parking, pedestrian amenities, good quality architecture, and a redevelopment friendly business district. So relatively small minimum lot size. They do have 60-foot minimum frontage, but that's not very much if you're trying to fit a building in. They do have a 25-foot setback, 3-story max 40-foot height. I'm not sure why it's both 40 and 36 there. I apologize. Again, a 0.4 FAR, similar to what West Acton has. And again, pretty modest parking requirements, and both a minimum and a maximum. So they try to keep people from building more than 4 spaces per 1,000 for retail, and allow no more than 1 per 1,000. So I think that's what we're seeing, and Bob could comment on that more, is that I think we're moving away. I hope we're moving away from minimum parking requirements. Let the developer, the business owner, the building owner decide how much parking is needed. Maybe put a minimum on there and calibrate it to the surrounding area, because you don't want somebody to be taking advantage of existing parking, but to not really require parking necessarily, especially if you can provide it with shared lots, public lots, and so on. So I'm going to let Bob carry on here with discussion of the draft bylaw and then some of his recommendations moving forward.
So we're going to talk first about the draft bylaw, and then talk about some zoning strategies, and talk about the some of the extra research I did just for this project with other other towns around New England, and some of the experiences they've had in going through this same process. And talk about draft zoning bylaw, and then some of the other towns and did some research into for this project, and some zoning strategies and recommendations for consideration as you go forward, because as Peter mentioned, zoning was, the writing of the zoning bylaw was not part of this project. It was something for the future phase, but some things for the town to consider. much of what's in the draft zoning bylaw is good language. It's going in the good direction. And so I just want to quickly concentrate on sort of a few major points here. One of the things, and this is both related to your existing bylaw and perhaps this draft, and I apologize if I've read things wrong. I've read over both the bylaw and the draft many times, but sometimes I don't quite catch what the intent is. The over-reliance on special permits. And in this case, I read this as it almost required everything to get a special permit. Well, there's a whole variety of problems with that, not the least of which is it's not allowed in the state. You can't have a district that requires special permits for every use. There's a long ago court case that's very famous out of the town of Braintree where they did that, and they were slapped down pretty strongly by the Supreme Judicial Court. Of course, there are also uses in Section 3 of Chapter 48 of the Zoning Act that in one way or another are either exempt from regulation or exempt from certain regulations or are only required to meet certain regulations, and you have to address those uses. But they are allowed uses, certainly like religious institutions or whatnot. So you have to make sure those are incorporated into your bylaws as well. And then I'm going to come back to this point when I get to the zoning strategies. Again, the use provisions, I know there's been a lot of talk among the planning board and the other committees and staff about, what are the appropriate uses to make the vision happen? What are the uses you really want to have here? What are the uses you really don't want to have here? I'll come back to that in a little bit. If you're going to have performance standards, and that can be a benefit to help create the outcomes you want, but you can't have vague language and you must have standards. You just can't say, well, the development should be done in accordance with the character of the town of Stowe, or broad statements like that, because what does that mean? And you don't want to end up in court trying to explain to a judge, how this, small shop somehow doesn't meet the character of the town. So something to think about. If you're going to use performance standards, you really need to have benchmarks and some particular language. Mixed use residential, Peter slightly mentioned this, limited to 4 units per acre. Peter and I are in agreement that is too low. If you, again, talking about the financial viability to see this corridor redeveloped and to see the kinds of benefits that you're talking about, whether it's open space or better architecture or better landscaping or whatnot, you have to take into account the balances of making your regulations flexible enough and opening up them enough so that you actually can have viable development and redevelopment. Just as an aside, I'll get to this in a minute. I looked at a number of towns around New England, and like Peter did, I talked to my colleagues around this region to give me some recommendations of towns that are doing the same thing, going through these same kind of processes, although they've already adopted their zoning. And one of them, which is in my report, is Enfield, New Hampshire, which is up near Lebanon, New Hampshire, right off of Interstate 89. Small town, 5,000 square feet. 5,000 square feet. The town is only 5,000 square feet. It's a really small town, 5,000 people. They have somewhat of a town center. It's not quite the old traditional, but they have kind of the strip commercial coming into the town center, and they were looking to create what you're trying to create and what somebody can do. 12 units per acre. That's their standard because they really wanted and understood that denser housing development in that area would provide more people on the street, more people supporting the businesses they wanted to attract to there. Quite frankly, raise the property values, so perhaps it would be more economically viable for developers to come in and build the mixed use developments that they wanted. So the connections are endless in what you need to think about in advancing your goals here. Ground floor uses, a classic provision in the draft that I see all the time. Towns say, oh, we don't want housing on the first floor of mixed-use buildings. What they almost always really mean is we don't want housing at the front of, on the first floor of the front of mixed-use buildings facing the street, because you want, logically, businesses, restaurants, cafes, shops, whatever. But there are mixed-use buildings being built where out the building is not only horizontal facing the street, but it also extends out the back of the building where the 2.5 or 3 stories of the building are 100% residential down to the ground floor. And there's design elements to make that work. And again, it provides for more opportunities for housing in this district for more people to be there 24/7, more eyes on the street, more eyes on the store, more people perhaps walking around. So again, when you're developing zoning, you have to be cautious of unintended consequences. You might be prohibiting something that would be good for your vision. Parking accommodations, I'll just say in general, your existing parking standards need a lot of revision. Peter mentioned some that they're too stringent. There's a lot of lonely asphalt in this world, in this country. You can't drive into any city or town practically and not see a lot of empty parking spaces that never get used. And that's because most communities have too stringent requirements. So something to think about. You've got a lot of good ideas in the draft about parking, landscaping and setbacks and buffers and breaking up parking lots. Next. So I think one of the most important initiatives you can do is, this is an important part of the town. It should receive the focus that respects that importance, and it should have its own zoning district, not an overlay district. It's a base, fundamental, underlying lower village business zoning district that focuses the regulations, the uses, the design guidelines, all the different aspects of the zoning district on what is it specifically that you can put into the zoning district that will open up the opportunities for your vision to be created. Not get in the way of your opportunities, not block your vision from being implemented, not make it a burden for someone to try to implement your vision, not making it as time consuming or as lengthy, or keep that in mind. If you really want this to happen, your zoning has to be structured in a way that allows it to happen and doesn't get in the way of it happening. Strong purpose section, I know the draft has a purpose section. That's connecting this to the visions and the goals and the intents of all this planning effort is really critical. Particularly if you end up in court for some reason or another. The judges like to look at the purpose section. The design guidelines, this is a balancing. How stringent do you get? Are they guidelines? Do you have some more specific standards within the guidelines? As Peter said, this is going to take time to transition from what you have to what you want. And so the guidelines need to bring that along, but it's a delicate balance from being too stringent to being too loose. We talked about the uses. I know, you've had lots of conversation about the uses, but you want to be flexible enough to allow the new kinds of uses. Think about the kinds of uses that have been happening, that towns have been grabbing on, in cities as well, to help revitalize city centers, town centers, village centers. Brew pubs. Everybody wants a brew pub because it brings people to a place. It activates the space. You know, breweries, now distilleries, food. Especially in the last couple of years, a lot of people decided they didn't want to work in an office space and they wanted to be I'll say crafts in food. They wanted to make things. That could be food or whatnot. There's all kinds of examples out there now where towns are looking to allow and encourage and even financially help what's called makerspace. Makerspace. You're making food in the back and you're selling it at retail in the front. You're making pottery in the back and you're selling arts and crafts and pottery in the front. You know, I noticed if I read this wrong, incorrectly, I apologize, but the existing business districts have this, if it's under 1,000 square feet, it's allowed by right. Over that, it requires a special permit. That's a problem. But it said retail sales, excluding retail sales of food. And I'm thinking, what is wrong with retail sales of food in a business district on a major commercial corridor? You can't have a cheese shop. You can't have a ethnic food store. You can't have a specialty food store. Those are the kinds of things that draw people to a place. It's not just a bunch of chain stores, it's local. Local people, startup businesses, people are already starting up that, have been running their businesses out of the garage or the basement and need some spaces. Those are the kinds of opportunities you may have here. I don't know that, but so many towns have found those opportunities are working out there, and that's what's being used to revitalize these spaces. Again, the design guidelines or standards should reflect goals for this district. So that's another reason to have a specific district. Densities really, need to think about appropriate densities that will support the businesses on site, nearby. So next slide. So one of the things that concerns me, quite frankly, is how much you rely on special permits for almost everything. I can't understand why retail stores over 1,000 square feet need special permits. If a bookstore, that would be an appropriate good use here. What is it about a bookstore that needs to go through a special permit process? Most of the communities, I would say almost pretty much every community that I've dealt with or looked at in terms of these kinds of revitalizing strategies, but just kind of normal businesses, retail stores, professional offices, coffee shops, cafes, food stores, small food stores, allow them by right or by right with a site plan review process, a good site plan review. And I've provided Jesse with a number of information about a number of different towns that have very strong site plan review process. So this is a by right process. You're not focusing on use. It's okay to have a retail store or a retail business here, but you're really focusing on the site and the building, landscaping, parking, access, signs, the front of the building, the pitch of the roof, all of those kind, where the trash is, the buffers around the site, connections to the scene. It's okay to have a retail use in a business zone. That's what it's designed for. It's okay to have, smaller, things like coffee shops or whatnot. By right, focus on what's important. And so much of your vision is design oriented. You want to keep that in mind. There are uses you want to have go through the special permit process, but you really have to have specific reasons. What is the issue about this use that we really want to have go through the site planning process? It's a big use. It has these potential big impacts, lots of people working there, or it's a nightclub that wants to stay open till 1 o'clock in the morning, things like that. But if you really need to think about opening up the opportunities for all kinds of businesses that meet the goals to get in here without having to go through a long and uncertain process like a site plan, like a special permit process. Part of this idea in dimensional standards and parking is you want to set some standards, but you also want to allow for flexibility. If somebody comes in and says, I could do it your way, but here's a way I'm thinking of changing the parking or changing the dimensional standards, and I think it meets the goals of your vision for the lower village, you should at least have that opportunity to have that discussion. So don't be too rigid and build in flexibility. And I know, I think both the draft and your existing bylaw has aspects of flexibility. So that's a good thing. Next. Next slide. Just taking a quick look at various cities and towns. I looked around, not cities, towns around New England. I would say I was trying to find towns either without some infrastructure or without infrastructure that were trying to do this to see what their experiences were, because you have some infrastructure issues here. But before I get to that, everything you see here is all the kinds of things you've been talking about that are in various planning documents in Stowe. The tools and techniques to accomplish what you want are pretty universal, but they're tweaked at the local level. One of the ones I have down here on the lower left, of course, is public realm improvements. And that's something to think about, probably maybe a little long-term, but I know you've got new sidewalks in there and you got some new crosswalks, but quite frankly, none of that's very pedestrian friendly compared to what other towns have done to make it a lot more pedestrian friendly. Sign standards, I provided a lot of information to Jesse about both how to change the zoning bylaw to meet constitutional requirements, but also to think about sign standards for this district. Next slide. And just some examples. Some of these are in the reports, but I just pulled a few of them out because I wanted to just show you. This is up on the left, and I mentioned before, I was a longtime planning director in Amherst, and we had a number of village centers, from ye old traditional village centers to strip 1960s village centers to more modern village centers. But this is, I don't know, maybe this is 5 or 6 years old, mixed use building, not all the way up on the sidewalk, but close to the sidewalk, well landscaped in front, parking on the side and rear, office apartments above. There's a cafe, coffee shop on one side, and I forgot what the uses are on the other. This is a district that 150 years ago had small mills in it, and so it's always been called the North Amherst Village Center Village District, but increasingly people are referring to it as the Mill District. And so there's one developer that's bought up a lot of the land, and this is a point to think about, and has been starting to build buildings in accordance with the village center zoning that we originally adopted really 20 years ago, and then has been tweaked over time. And so the form of this building, and you can see sort of what is supposed to be a replica of a mill building in colors and design, and the cap on the top of it. Site plan review, not special permit, site plan review. The Dunkin' Donuts on Route 28 in Falmouth. This is west of downtown, which is pretty, I'm sure many of you have been on Route 28 in Falmouth. Has a nice downtown. Going west of it, it turns into a big strip commercial. They've been working to change the design and focus of new development, new commercial development along the corridor. There's a new CVS that's well done. There's a couple of other buildings well done. This is done through site plan review. Dunkin' Donuts, parking's in the back. Got benches and seats out front. Nice stone wall. There was a building across the street that had been there for years. A historic building, and it had a nice stone wall in front, and they got Dunkin' Donuts to build a stone wall to replicate across the street through the site plan review process. Again, you have strong standards as to how projects go through site plan review, but you don't need a 2/3 vote. You don't need to spend 155 days doing it, and you don't. It's a has a more definitive outcome because the use is allowed. Stratham, New Hampshire, again, Route 108, major commercial north-south route through Stratham. No water and sewer along this corridor. So you're not going to get, the buildings close to each other, but they focused on design and they focused on public realm. The building on the right, the medical offices, it was a big lot. So for whatever reason, the developer set it way back, but heavily landscaped between the road and the parking lot. The restaurant on the left is just off the picture to the left is the sidewalk, the public sidewalk in the road. On the right, ye old New England architecture. On the left, modern architecture. So they weren't trying to create a period piece. They were looking for good architecture, what they felt was good architecture, good site design, good building design. Next. So this is Route 1 in Falmouth, Maine. Again, I'm sure many of you have been on this road. Major strip commercial. Falmouth went through a long planning process, completely revised their zoning, created four village zoning sub-districts, if you will. Again, thinking of using various of the tools and techniques mentioned. And here, the public realm was very important. So in the top picture, you will see they moved the sidewalks off the curb. Sidewalks, which are pretty common, and the state does this all the time in Massachusetts, which they did in Stowe, sometimes because of property boundaries and whatnot. Sidewalks that are immediately against the curb on a major commercial street where cars are whizzing by very closely at 40 miles an hour or more is a very unsafe feeling for pedestrians. The best option, and Peter mentioned this, is if you can get on-street parking. That provides a safety barrier for people walking on sidewalks. And there's been a lot of studies on this in terms of feeling and surveys of feeling safe. Barring the inability to have on-street parking, and this Route 1 is one of these, moving the sidewalk inward, having a green strip, and you can see some, new street trees. So this whole corridor will have street trees, which will grow up. And of course, street trees slows traffic. As the street trees grow, people will literally slow down because they feel a sense of enclosure on the road. But it also gives a sense of safety to the pedestrians. The public realm lighting, both the traffic lights and the street lighting are not the usual aluminum poles and ugly Cobra lights and whatnot, but historic looking piece. They're all black, which is the classic look for revitalized public realm and village and town centers. You can't see this very well, but off the street on the right is a bike path that was built along. They looked at building it on the street, but they wanted to have a middle lane because there's so many turning movements. So there's a middle left and right turning lane. So they put a bike path up the right. This is the east side of the street. You can see some of the newer development off the street, heavily landscaped. The peak roofs, Peter mentioned, a little more space in the second floors, so it's usable. And the last one here, I show this to a lot of people just to show what a gas station could look like. But for a couple of other reasons. This is actually a mixed-use building. And the left side of the building is almost on the sidewalk, but there's a landscape area in front of the building. This is actually a cafe. So the whole left side of the building is a cafe. And then across the rest is a gas station. But how many gas stations have you seen that look like this? Very peaked roof, enormous windows, crescent, the Palladian kind of window shapes over the entrance instead of the blank walls, a gas station / convenience store. So many of the ones that get built are blank walls with a couple of doors and small windows on the side. For what it is, very well done. You can see again, smaller street trees that are gonna grow up. Sidewalk, even here, is a wider distance between the curb and the sidewalk than above. And then even the canopy, you almost got a cornice. You've got a cornice design on the canopy, a little gable where the light is. So these all came out of the strong guidelines and standards for architectural and land and site planning in Falmouth. So just some visions from other towns. You have my report. You can see in terms of the water and sewer, I did run into one town that went through all this process that didn't have water and sewer, and they got to the end of the zoning and they decided not to adopt it because they decided without water and sewer, nothing was going to happen. A few towns either had no water or sewer, Enfield was one of them, and Falmouth had water and sewer on part of this Route 1, but not in other parts. So how did they fix, what did they do? Well, a couple of towns adopted tax increment financing. They felt they had a strong enough market that they would, with the improvements, they would get new development, and then the taxes from new development would go to pay off the bond to build the water and sewer. Some use local funds, some use state and federal money. There's certainly been a lot of state money and grants for all kinds of infrastructure. One small town in Vermont actually had had water, but no sewer in the town, although it had a ye old, in the town center, it had a ye old town center, but they couldn't get any new development because of sewer issues. They actually built a huge, basically sewage facility and under their town common. And used state funds and local funds. They bonded it, and I believe they bonded it. And then they got both new development, but they got a lot of renovated development from some pretty old buildings that were in tough shape. So there are ways to think about it. Next slide. And this is back to Peter.
Right. So want to show a few, just this example of design guidelines quickly, and we do want to give you a chance to ask your questions and have some discussion. But I think overall, as Bob suggests, we want to maintain the flexibility and use sort of site plan review process to provide for a sort of back and forth between the owners and developers and the planning board and others. But there needs to be sort of clear idea of what the town wants to see in this district. So it's not going to be saying you must do this, but it's pretty easy to say, we really want you to do it this way, and then give them the flexibility to respond in different ways. And so, design guidelines are sort of a classic way to manage that back and forth, where you have examples that show clearly what you're after, both in sort of the detailed elements of the design and also the overall spirit and character of what you're after. So I want to show, this is design guidelines we did last winter for Littleton as part of their proposed Littleton Station 40R district. They unfortunately didn't quite pull the trigger on this yet, So they backed off and they're still talking about it, but we're hoping it goes forward. But essentially, within the design guidelines, it incorporates, again, what I started talking about, which is the principles which you've developed in the plan for the district. So what are we trying to achieve? And in this case, it's describing that just for architecture. And there are other sections for landscaping and site planning and streetscape and so on. So for each of those, you're saying, what are we trying to achieve when we're looking at architecture? And then you can sort of calibrate that to say, well, we want it to be exactly like such and such a building, or we want to say, you know, we want to focus on authenticity, which is what we're recommending here. And then sort of the second paragraph there is the specific standards that go with it. So how do we want to achieve that principle, right? Are there specific standards that we want to be defined? And that those could, again, be, you know, as loose or as tight as you want. So certain things like, you know, minimum maxing parking, you can have specific standards. Other things can be a little bit looser. And then I think a really important part is having examples within the design guidelines that say, you know, what's an example of something that meets the approach that we're trying to achieve? And again, well, here's West Acton, which was another good example, as well as, you know, Manchester. They've done some nice infill development in Manchester by the Sea, and then Red Brook Village, which is sort of has a planned village in the center of it. So really trying to show what you want, as well as describing what you want in terms of the overall principles. And again, this, you know, this gives the guidelines a little bit of teeth, even though they're not as strong as, say, a form-based code might be. You're connecting the guidelines to the plan. And that, of course, is very important, you know, constitutionally in terms of the function of the zoning. So it's saying that the guidelines are rooted in a process for this particular place that's been adopted by the town. And then this is just an example of, you can go into a lot of detail, especially with traditional architectural detailing, talk about materials and surface appearance. In this case, how the building should be, the facade elements should be structured, and sort of think about that balance between sort of the functional elements like amount of transparency. Should it be 60% transparency as shown here on the ground floor, 40% above? Think about those functional elements and whether or not that's the most important thing, or whether we literally want to be duplicating a sort of traditional historic buildings. But we show these examples. I mean, these are both historic buildings, but you could do all of the same elements, and people have done very nicely with very contemporary buildings, because all of these things are about, you can argue they're about function in terms of transparency, in terms of identifying doorways, in terms of, you know, a building that works well, but also they generally tend to make a building look good. There's a sort of a rhythm to the facade. There's sort of broken up into sort of a certain articulation, we say. And that's what makes, whether it's a contemporary or a traditional building, that's what makes it work, both aesthetically and functionally. Now, the thing is, it's often easier to duplicate a historic building and achieve those goals, because that was figured out 150 years ago and tested over time, what makes an attractive and functional building. If you try to do it with a contemporary building, you really have to be pretty good. That's why we have a lot of ugly contemporary buildings that don't really achieve what historic buildings do. But the problem we often get into is that people think it's the problem is with contemporary architecture. The problem is with bad design, you could say. So to be safe, you could say we only want to have historical buildings, or you could say we want you to hire a good architect who knows what they're doing. Anyway, that's the conclusion of our presentation. And now we'd be glad to hear your thoughts and questions, if any.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Bob. A lot of information there, obviously spanning zoning, infrastructure, streetscapes, kind of sums up the last 10 solid years of planning effort in terms of covering all the bases of what we've been thinking about. So if folks have any questions and they want to raise their hand, that'll kind of shoot you up into the top corner of our screen, and then we can call on you there if there are any questions out there. I think what I'd like to do first is ask members of the Planning Board, the Revitalization Subcommittee, as well as the Economic Development Industrial Commission, if there are any comments on the presentation or any questions that you may have.
All right, Jesse, so I'll say something. So this would be great if we had a blank slate down there in Lower Village with just open parcels, but we have existing buildings and we have existing property owners who haven't been able to fill vacant spaces. And I just can't even see how they would do these rebuilding efforts of their properties without so much assistance and change to everything down there. It all looks great, but we just have such a different layout down there than West Acton or Concord or any of these places with great little mixed use villages. So just not sure how we would take the big step and who would do it down there.
If I could, there's actually a lot of different aspects to that question, but it's a very good question. Certainly one of the aspects of zoning going forward, if you do go forward, is how are you going to deal with non-conforming uses that you likely would create by creating the new zoning. And towns have great flexibility on, you know, how they treat non-conformities, from being very strict to being very, you know, very friendly. But one of the things that Peter and I have talked about, and we've had experiences in other towns, it does happen that in some towns that are even, you know, in your situation, at a certain moment in time, somebody or somebodies, either from inside the town or from outside the town, decide that there's an opportunity here to redevelop the properties. They come in and perhaps start purchasing properties if they can, and, you know, start looking at what the town's vision is, and then to see what the possibilities are in terms of the finances and, you know, market values and all of that. Sometimes some of these in towns where there's been property that's been held by people for a long time, sometimes, you know, when people get to retirement age or something, they sell off the properties. And then that's the potential another opportunity. We actually, we're gonna probably suggest this to Jesse, but we'll suggest this to all of you. One of the strategies is actually, you know, one of the aspects of doing particularly mixed use is there's not a lot of developers out there that do small scale mixed use in, you know, smaller towns and villages, but there are them, and there's a lot more today than there were 10 years ago, is actually talk to them, bring them in, or go talk to them, just to get an idea from them, sort of what is feasible, what's not feasible, what's the relationship between the market, the value of the land, and, you know, the goals of the town, to get sort of a real world response at this moment in time. But as you all know, this vision is a long-term vision. And, you know, sometimes it's just a catalyst. One person comes in, does a new development, really nice, well done, and makes money. Well, if you get those two combinations, that attracts the attention of others.
I think one thing I think you know also is that this is going to happen incrementally, and it's, you know, it may turn over at some point, but we can't necessarily plan for that. But a lot of the principles which you've identified in terms of trying to create a pedestrian friendly place can be applied even with the kind of small changes and incremental changes that you're seeing already. So if someone is redeveloping one building, you know, how do you make the streetscape more comfortable for pedestrians? You don't have to change the building. It just might mean changing sidewalks and landscaping. How do you introduce, you know, plant a few trees, right? Make things a little bit better for the next generation. Connect the parking lot in the rear with the lot next door. If you can get people to do that, that alone makes a big difference. Encourage shared parking. So two owners maybe aren't sure they want to redo their parking, but maybe if they do something together, they can both benefit. Make that possible and encourage it. Encourage people to close off parking, you know, access points that they don't need. All of that can happen on the existing, you know, shopping strip. It doesn't have to be wholesale redeveloped. So that's another filter to look at this through, is what could you apply to things the way they are now to make them better as that kind of incremental just renovation happens using existing buildings. And then you put on, well, if somebody wants to expand a building, you say, well, we want you to expand it according to our vision of the whole thing. So you make something that's sort of calibrated to any change at any level, but following the same overall principles. That's why having those principles is really valuable and a great, I think, success of your ongoing effort here, sort of identifying what it is you want.
All right.
Jesse, I have
go ahead.
a comment and a question.
Okay.
If it's okay.
Yep, and then I got a couple of raised hands after that, so go ahead.
So first off, thanks for this report out. I like the fact that there were a lot of examples as well as a lot of actionable things in terms of things that we can change about our existing zoning bylaws. My question is around something we've struggled with, which is I saw in there you indicate residential mixed use is important, but you also indicate that you don't want it to be the primary, I can't remember the word used, use. And that has been one of our struggles, that the district is so small. You know, we want it to be supplemental, not, we don't want to lose a business lot to residential because the business district is so small. So, you know, you did call out not making it the primary. I know that's not the word used. I can't remember the word you used, but I'm curious to know from a zoning standpoint, approaches that you recommend in trying to achieve that.
So again, like a couple of different things to think about. One is a ratio, size of retail or size of business use to size of residential use on the same property or within the same building. That's one thing to think about. One of the things that I know has happened in a couple of towns that's caused problems, and I may have mentioned this in the past, was the developers figured out mixed use meant having a small commercial building in front and a whole bunch of apartments in back. And so, you know, you need to really clearly define what mixed use is and what can happen on a site in terms of mixed use. It might be okay to have two buildings, but maybe not. But you don't want to have a bunch of residential buildings in, you know, like a little tiny store in the front or something like that. So yes, you're looking for that balance between not having this corridor turned into a residential corridor, because that doesn't seem to be what you want, versus having what I mentioned, sort of on-site residents that can be supportive of the businesses and the type of businesses that you want to attract here. And, you know, so there's a variety of different kinds of techniques to use that, you know. So I just mentioned a couple.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bev. I'm gonna, Lori, if you're done for now, I'm gonna go to Linda Hathaway, who's had her hand raised. Oh, sorry, Linda, you're muted again. That was my fault.
Sorry. So my question is, you mentioned about the walkability of lower, you know, of like West Acton and some of the other sections of where they have these nice little villages. And the walkability in Lower Village is very poor because none of this, you know, the side streets, the very few of them, except for Pompasiticate, have sidewalks that get people there. And then the density of the residential area around Lower Village is minimal. And so I'm just thinking, like, how do you, because I think people that use Lower Village drive there. I mean, even from my house on Crescent Street, and I'm not proposing sidewalks the way that last one to do that probably, but just to get there, I mean, I would not walk there to get, you know, and I'm less than a mile from there. But so that was one of the questions. And then actually, I'm going to skip over and I'll let someone else talk. But that I just kind of want to figure out, how do you promote that other piece of it to make it more walkable, to get more people there?
Well, again, I mean, it starts in increments. I mean, you can have both, and most places do, and certainly the developers of all of these new destination sort of lifestyle centers provide plenty of parking. They just put it in the back. So I guess that's, you know, you make it possible for people to drive there for the time being. And then over time, you make it easier and easier for people to ride a bike or to walk. But I think the most important thing in the short term is being able to walk within the district. So you park once and it's, you know, a nice place to walk around, and you can get from the different uses that you want to visit easily. You know, I think the little common there is a real, you know, potential gem to do more with, to make it a destination where you want to visit just to be in that space. And you know, the cemetery across the street, and then the, you know, how could you connect to the open space to the north and the south? Are there trail connections? How do you connect to other areas in the town? So you're really thinking about it in terms of, you know, the master plan for the whole neighborhood, which may be the next step if you haven't thought about it before. It's really thinking about how, again, we've done a lot of things, including purchasing open space over the years without maybe coordinating it very much. So now's the opportunity to really think about how can we knit those different uses together and sort of over time, you know, make this again a real functional node, not just for cars arriving from out of town, but again, as you say, people walking from the neighborhood.
I would just quickly say, it's not just about getting people from, you know, the residential areas around walking to this district, although that would be part of it. And you're right, this is going to be a long-term effort because you're starting where you're starting at. But it is to think about incremental, as Peter said. But one of the things I think I mentioned was activating the space, and Peter mentioned it, showed it one of the slides. Think about, you know, activating the space that you have now. The common's small, but, you know, perhaps there could be some events, and maybe in conjunction with the shopping center, because they have a huge parking lot there. And I'm just throwing what maybe some people think will be a crazy idea out, but what if you had a food truck festival in the parking lot and around the common? And you had something on the south side of the street. Maybe some of the food trucks are on the south side of the street in different parking lots. And people would have to cross from one side to the other. You want to have good crosswalks. You want to have good safety there. You might, you know, just starting off, you might need to have a police presence, you know, just to make everybody safe and get all the traffic to slow down. But activating the space so people see it in a different way while they're on their feet, not in a car, is something to think about in terms of, you know, moving down the road towards the ultimate goal.
Right, I've got another hand raised here. Lee, I'm gonna go to you.
Okay, thank you. The different studies that these have all kind of stemmed off of, they go back as far as like 20 years, right? Because the residents in the area have changed in that amount of time. Do the residents in the area, especially those of us who live in or around Lower Village, even want this? Because I got to tell you, I don't like any of the proposals. I think that it's more appropriate for a rural, undeveloped area. I think that we're missing the mark here. Instead of going bigger, we need to go smaller and more sustainable and more mom and pop, small business, because that's what Stowe is about. These plans look like we're trying to become something that we were never intended to be. And it's totally losing sight of the history. It's bad enough that the shopping center got built in the oldest part of town anyway, but now these buildings, they're not to scale to the rest of the building, to what's in the area, and it's not addressing the abutters. I, as the next door neighbor to all of this, don't want people from all other towns to come to descend upon Stowe to participate in activities next to my yard. I don't want that. And I just am curious, has anybody reached out to the neighboring community who live here, not people who are, out by the golf courses or something, but the actual people who live in and around the lower village, how this is going to impact us. Because this is something that's been talked about for 20 years, but doesn't go anywhere because there isn't water. So maybe we should move on from this and develop by being sustainable and building businesses that don't need more water and that will be naturally more walkable because they're smaller. These places that I personally avoid places like that like the plague. The only time I might go to a restaurant that's in a development like that is because somebody else suggested the restaurant. I am more inclined to go to a mom and pop restaurant or a gift shop or small business than something in one of these mammoth places that's cookie cutter franchises. And that's what all the examples that were shown were like bringing in franchise businesses. Is that what we want for Stowe? And has the community been really asked recently?
So I'm just gonna, there's obviously a lot there.
Yeah.
I think what I'm gonna just basically respond to is, I can't really count on my fingers and toes how many times we have held forums, done surveys, sent letters, reached out to different property owners, people who live in the district. We've got folks on different committees here who live in and around Lower Village. I can just say personally, I'm very comfortable with the amount of outreach that has been done and the amount of information that we've gathered. And it's never done. You never close the book on reaching out to people. And so obviously just through this process, there's going to be a lot more opportunity for folks like yourself and who live right in the district to weigh in. But I do think that it's been a pretty good multi-stakeholder process to date. So, I don't know if planning board feels
so similar. That being said, I'll add one thing, Lee, is that we're all seeing this for the first time. The examples they shared tonight, except minus Acton, we're seeing for the first time. So, we're seeing what they're presenting, and we need to then shape that to make sure ultimately it's shaped based on feedback from the town, which, as Jesse said, we've done multiple times. So I guess I just want to acknowledge that, where there's some examples in there that I may not care for as well, sure. But that, again, so I would not, for everyone sort of on the call, I would say, this is what the consultants are presenting back to us. We need to debrief and then shape where we want to go with it. So that's my comment.
And maybe I could just clarify, the purpose of the case studies is not necessarily say, you should do this exactly. They're sort of to help illustrate, first, what are developers building? What's making people money, because that's what is likely to get built in the future, and and why. What were some of the design ideas that they incorporated? What are some of the zoning techniques that the town had in place that allowed that to happen. I think the design guidelines is where you really get the chance to shape the scale and the, well also in the density and use requirements of the zoning, but the design guidelines lets you customize the sort of the scale and the feel of it. And you can put in examples that meet what you think is appropriate for Lower Village. And that absolutely should include in that process the local, the neighborhood stakeholders, as well as those of you from other parts of town. So again, I apologize if you were shocked by any of those examples. Obviously, we don't have the room, and we're not recommending, South County Commons coming in with 100,000 square feet of new development. But you can learn by looking at these things, both sort of design techniques, but also, what the developers are thinking and what they're likely to build. So.
Mark, I know you've had your hand raised for a while now.
Hi, Peter and Bob. I appreciate all the information you've been giving us. I think it's good information. One of the issues I have is these developments that you've shown us. How many of those have you been involved with before the development happened? Were they owned by private business owners? Were they vacant lots, or was it something that was renovated down? And how big are these lots? I mean, we've got maybe 15 acres or maybe a little bit more on that strip on the south side. Linear doesn't want anything to do with this, I don't believe. So how is this going to help us? And were the business owners who developed these lots, were they interested in the project? Because I don't believe any of the business owners on the south side of the road are interested in any kind of this. They haven't put any money forward doing any kind of interest in getting water, sewer, or anything else. They're just kind of waiting for a free ride from the town to give them water and sewer to try and develop their properties. And I'm not even sure they're willing to do that. They're making $250,000 a year on their properties now, which is peanuts in the business world. But it's what gives them initiative to do that? What gave these other people the initiative to do that?
If I could just a couple of responses, Mark. I would say both from examples I gave today, and I have hundreds of examples in my career that I've worked on in multiple states. The lot sizes all over the place, from very tiny to very big. A lot of the examples that I used in my report were from towns and smaller villages that had smaller lots. I wasn't looking at any opportunities for building big buildings or shopping centers or anything like that. They were all trying to focus on smaller lots, everything from down to 3,000 or 4,000 square feet to 10,000 square feet or something like that. Again, a mix. Some of the lots that I've seen this kind of development go on have been vacant for years. Somebody owned it, didn't, just owned it, paid their taxes every year and just owned it. But for some reason, they sold it, or they decided after owning it for so many years, the time was right to do some development on it, or somebody came in and offered them a pile of money to buy the lot to build something. A whole variety, or there's family situations, family situations change, suddenly property comes available. Some are older properties that got redeveloped. The building there got redeveloped as the building there, and some were new. It's a real mix, and you can't always say why this happened here at this moment in time, but you need somebody that's interested and willing and can pay to do it.
But they have to be willing and willing to pay, which I don't believe we have right now. I don't think any of the zoning rules should be changed at this point, because we don't have any of the business owners who are on board. Until we get them on board, I mean, to say, well, gee, we're going to bring town water, town sewer into the lower village, and then all these business owners are going to say, gee, good idea, let's do this. Let's spend $10 million on a project. I don't see that happening. But anyway, I appreciate all your information, and let somebody else have a question now.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I'm just so everybody knows, I'm conscious of the time here. I know it's getting close to 9. I'm going to try to keep us to that kind of logical deadline, unless we have a lot of folks that want to keep going. So Tom, I'm going to Tom Farnsworth, pass it to you. You've had your hand up now.
Sorry, turn my mic on so you can hear me, which would probably help a lot. So having been on the Lower Village Subcommittee, I guess I just want to piggyback on Lori and Jesse's comments and reiterate that we're trying to create a roadmap for the future. This is not a plan for development. And that we're trying to, look at what are the guidelines that we want to have in place should that time come when developers are looking at making changes and what we want them to look like. So that is, we're not looking at this saying we're bringing in mega stores and, populations or anything like that. We're looking at it as saying, what do we want the future to look like? And how do we want to, what are the guidelines we want in place to make it be something that fits with the character of Stowe and something that the residents can live with and will be happy with. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. Meg Costello.
I just had a quick question. What was the name of that town where you said that they put the sewerage system under the commons? And my second question follow-up to that is, would it be possible to do that in the small area that we have in the commons right there in front of the Stowe Plaza? And we do have drainage there now, so I'm not sure. Is this even feasible?
I don't remember the exact town that did that. It was a town in Vermont. I do know that, but I don't have the name with me right at the moment. And I would say, and this is just based on looking at the town common in the Lower Village, that's probably way too small to do much of any infrastructure under it that would serve serve that whole corridor or part of that corridor. That's just my kind of off the cuff impression.
Thank you.
In general, the wastewater technology has come a long way in the last 10 or 15 years. And one of the things I think we've learned collectively is that you don't have to build a giant municipal system. That used to be the ultimate answer. Everything else was just kind of a stopgap. And one of the things I've learned more recently is that there are lots of ways to build smaller distributed systems to do hybrid systems of all kinds that sort of combine individual septic tanks with shared wastewater infiltration fields and so on. A lot of it has to do with soil conditions. So if the soil is really good, you can do a lot. If the soil is terrible, you're kind of stuck. And I don't know enough about the soils there to say, but so as with everything else, it's, it costs a lot. And I think Mark hit on the fundamental question is, how do you change the economic equation to make people move towards something better than what's there now? And part of that is, the idea of a public subsidy or public investment in the wastewater. I know we're working in Groton, where there's at the entrance to the town, there's sort of a gateway commercial district. And the town worked with Mass Development to bring in a whole bunch of money to extend a sewer line, I think from Devon's, to service that area, to the benefit primarily of the commercial landowners. But that was tied with then a plan that said, we want you to build something better there. And, people will only do something if they can, get their money back out of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I do want to make just one comment from kind of the planning department realm, and then I'm going to hand it over to the last hand up here. But, I think one of the common tensions that's run through all of this, and I'm hearing it in some of the comments tonight, is this idea of why bother? What's the use right now if we don't have water or sewer, we don't have property owners who are on board? And we've thought about that a lot, obviously, over the years. And I have really kind of two things I wanted to say about that. And the reason why I'm not as concerned about whether or not we have the right mix of property owners now, or that we have water and sewer in place, is that two things. It may very well be that what we're planning for is something more longer term than maybe a horizon. Than I think some of us would like to see something happen right away. And so there is this acknowledgement that, this might be a longer time horizon. We might be talking about the children of some of the property owners are there, or totally new people that come in the way that Bob described. Suddenly there's an opening and an opportunity and somebody sells. To that end, I think a lot of times, and what I've seen in my hometown and in other places in just a short time that I've been doing the planning stuff, so to speak, is that sometimes things happen just really fast and out of the blue. And one of the things we want to make sure is that the zoning is in place, even if it doesn't feel like anything is happening right now. And just to give you an example, Stowe right now is under a lot of pressure. We're going through what I would call is a new housing boom. We've got a bunch of units potentially in the mix at Stowe Acres and off of Hudson Road. We have a multi-million-dollar investment at Academy at the Bose property. Things are changing whether we like it or not. And it's changing the way that it's changing the number of people that are in and around Stowe, and it changes the market, so to speak. I don't know which way that will be, but I think it drives home the point that if we are just to look very narrowly at where we are right in time, it might seem like none of this has there's not a logical reason to it, but I want to make sure that I think the planning board and the others are on the right path and trying to get the zoning in place, because we can't necessarily foresee exactly what's going to happen, and we want to be prepared. So that is why I'm excited to be doing this, even though I know that maybe all the pieces are not in place to see some of the kind of rapid successes that we've seen in some other communities. So I've just been thinking about that a while. I wanted to get that off. I want to, we can certainly go to some others, but I know that Dorothy, you've had your hand up for a little while.
Hi, I do have a concern with the fact that I've been here for 20 years and this is, redone, and we just need water, and we just need water there. So these zoning regulations, if they're made when there is not water there and there's not the infrastructure to handle that wastewater, will they take in consideration what needs to go in? If that ever does happen, is one question, so that things aren't like having to be ripped up, or we're not like having to worry so much about, yes, the soil quality in Stowe is very good for drainage. But if you look at one property, the mobile property, that's a formal waste site. I would not want any drainage going near there. Is there going to be a wastewater facility to take this water away? And another strong thing is, as much as I'm for, yes, let's have a greater assortment of businesses. I do not look for fast food restaurants. I'm not for any of that. It's more like something that can support local community. It's very hard to take in how water will be financed in any way at all, even with just the $20,000 to $80,000 for their study that's being done for the feasibility, for businesses that are for profit, that bought in Stowe in the same way that residents did, knowing that there was no public water and no sewage. So I just would hope that somehow that's addressed, so that we can feel like you're on board in a positive manner and not just one of why. That's, as I realize it, it needs to be done if for some other type of businesses, but there's a lot to it. There's a lot to the history of what's in the land in some of those properties. And I just have not heard anything concrete as to why we should want to have any of our tax funds put in to benefit a for-profit business. When in the past, when one of the water companies that was handling a development went bankrupt, no one supported them. These people with the homes had to run out and get a new well dug quick and could be. So waiting to hear something that helps make it make sense and make it feel like it's fair. And that's my comment. So I will leave that. Thank you for listening.
I'm going to just ask we're a couple minutes before 9 here. I wanted to ask the board members and anyone else if there are any leftover comments, questions. I don't currently have any other hands raised. Courtney, I see you just raised your hand.
Hey there, I just wanted to say how interesting and informative this presentation was and how grateful I am for all the years of work that have been done on this topic. I'm beginning to understand that zoning and planning are these very slow, steady, if we're lucky, processes. And I just think it's great that you've gone to this particular step. I'm very inspired to see examples like the West Acton Village development. I personally think if we could get that in our lower village, we would be so lucky. So I just wanted to say thank you for your efforts, all of you.
Thanks, Courtney. All right. If there are no other comments, I'm just going to give you a quick idea of what happens from here. Peter and Bob, thank you so much for the presentation. I think this was enormously helpful. I know just from my perspective and from Malcolm's, we've been, kind of eagerly awaiting to kind of hear some of the thoughts in terms of zoning and to have some of, the experience behind it that you both bring is a big help to us, because where we're eventually going here is in the kind of the next steps is trying to take this initial bylaw draft that we roughed up for the purpose of this process and try to incorporate some of these recommendations, kind of a step-by-step manner, take it back to the town and kind of get ourselves a little bit closer to coalescing around something that would, bring us to that vision that we talked about. So obviously some more steps to go here, more outreach to be done, more comments to be incorporated, but I do think this is a big step forward. So many thanks. I think with that, I don't know if there's any other final comments, but with that, I think we'll follow up. We'll have this meeting, it's been recorded. We'll put up a link to it and we'll give it to Stowe TV as well. And so hopefully if folks want to revisit it, you'll have the opportunity to do so. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Thank you all.